Okay. Well, good morning. Sorry to break up the fellowship, because that's always important. And some would say the good stuff. So, as we're continuing on today, last week we presented some things about kind of what would be called the conservative position that was pushing back against all these changes that were happening in their time of modernism, and I know last week was kind of tough for everybody, because we were kind of hanging out in that academic stratosphere, and sometimes that can be really difficult. And so, but kind of the gist of it is that the Machen was claiming that these things that liberalism had done and really wasn't a religion at all. And so we kind of see the cartoon that highlights that position that we ended on, that we see this descent. And so you see this pushback that's going on. And so today I wanted to present, and I think it'll be more understandable than last week's was. But we want to look and see what is the position of one that is advocating for these changes in positions. And I hope that we've seen all along that we would think, well that's them, that's the enemy, those are those guys, and so whatever they do mustn't be right and must be wrong. And we often categorize those things. We do that in politics, we do that in all kinds of things. Like we're in the right position, something's wrong with them, and so on and so forth. And so I wanted to present what one of the proponents of the modernist way of looking at things, what he said. And I think that we'll find that it isn't all crazy or nuts. And just because they may have come to conclusions on some things that we find, and I'm not saying we shouldn't go, how could you do that? That some of the premise of what they're talking about is not totally crazy. And so Shaler Matthews, who we said was the other representative, wrote this book, The Faith of Modernism, as a response to liberalism and Christianity that we talked a little about last week. In it, he strives to present the case for the embrace of modernism and what is labeled its liberal theology. In The Faith of Modernism, Matthews declares modernism is a projection of the Christian movement into modern conditions. In other words, in his view, what we're trying to do is we're trying to update the application of what our Christianity is. After all, we don't live in medieval times and how they did things and looked at things and so on and so forth, and other times. And so this is us now. How does this have meaning to us? And the divide between what we call conservatives and liberals is based on their ways of determining what is true, stating some rely on the scientific method and some rely on church authority. And of course, what does that mean? Well, remember we talked about that there was, the church authority means, well, they established this in the past as so, and so it must be so. And so some would say you shouldn't question that, is what he's referring to. And we're saying, hey, we're we're looking at things, we're applying this scientific method, if you will, to the understanding of things, and we've talked a lot about that. And so he's viewing it as a different way that is being approached. Modernists are not members of a group which are prescribing doctrinal views, but Christians who use certain methods of thoughts are described as modernists in his presentation of that. Scott.
I want to be sure, as we talk about this, that we leave no doubt. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I want to be sure as we talk about this that we leave no doubt that these are not just two contrary opinions, as though either side could be right.
Yes.
That's not true. The truth is that the scientific method can do nothing to establish spiritual truths. In fact, the scientific method relies upon spiritual truth.
Sure. And so, yeah. And so as we continue to look at this, remember, we're trying to present what he's saying as to why. I'm not saying we necessarily hold on to that or agree with that. And so in his view, there are two social minds at work in the world. One that seeks to reassert the past, and the other seeks by new methods to gain what he calls efficiency. Such attitudes are the result of human nature. In life, there are inheritance and variations. All human affairs have their youth movement and what he calls the stand patters. And of course, what does he mean by that? Well, the youth movement are those that want to do things differently. We see it differently, and so on and so forth. We were youth movement at one time. We looked at some things different than our parents did or the generation before did, and it's always been that way. That's nothing new. And others say, why? We didn't need to change anything. We got it all figured out. And so that's how he's kind of framing this, however accurately or inaccurately. Between the two, there is always more or less a struggle. And we see it today in literature and in art, business, international politics. It is therefore only natural that it should appear in the field of Christianity. And so he's saying these back and forth tensions are in all kinds of things, and we see it here too. It's a way of thinking and looking at it. And I could sit here and tell you all about the art part of it. And then, others would know about, perhaps some of these other things. Now remember, this was written 100 years ago. Yes, Bill.
You can sit here and tell us all about the art part, but that doesn't mean we're going to agree.
No, but remember, it isn't always about agreement. Yeah. It's about trying to understand what's going on, okay, which is different than that. Christianity is not a hard and fast system of philosophy or orthodoxy accepted by all those who call themselves Christians. It is a religion which Christians believe and practice. Okay, now let's emphasize on practice as a point that he's going to be making. There have always been differences within the church, and these differences have been of many sorts. But at the bottom, Christianity has been the attempt of men to rely on Christian principles in meeting the needs of their actual life situations. What is he talking about? What do you think he means by that, Scott?
Well, he's saying that you can write Christian principles without biblical revelation. That's preposterous.
Okay. And some of them are going to come to those. Some of them are going to do that, which of course we see as part of the pushback on how, like, wait, how did you come to that conclusion? And so, yeah, we're going to see that. And so this idea is, Carl.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if we had more Christians that did that practice Christian principles for other people that see them? Wouldn't that be a good example? Yeah.
I think there's something in the Bible about that, isn't there? About Jesus talking about that. Yeah.
people, well, maybe not, pretend to Christian, do not practice Christian.
Sure, sure. And we see that people claim to be Christians, not we've seen that throughout history. And we see these reactions to that and all that have gone on, and that's valid. That's a valid point. And so the here and now is very significant, you're right, in the modernist thinking. And they're calling that application. In other words, they would say, hey, if your Christianity is only your intellectual understanding of a certain set of ideas and it doesn't do anything, what good is it? Is part of where they're coming from. Now, there would be good people that would disagree with where that led many of them. Okay? And so, however, that question, and so it's this idea of this, how do we see in this evidenced? Is part of what this is. But at the bottom, Christianity has been an attempt of men to rely on Christian principles to meet those life situations. How do we make our Christianity practical? Now, as we're working up to the social gospel, or understanding what that was, keep this in mind. Because this is a big chunk of the foundation of that understanding. In making such attempts, two types of Christians have always been found. There have been those who, without serious recognition of moral imperatives, have wished to enforce inherited beliefs and institutions, and those who have sought to examine their inheritance reject whatever has been outgrown and restate its permanent elements from a point of view and of the satisfaction of new needs. Social and cultural changes due to forces of many sorts have lain back on such theological adjustments. Okay, that's a really, whoa, yes, there's a lot being said there. But in essence, what it's saying, in his view, is there's those who are not recognizing these implications. Here we have all these needs out there, but you're doing nothing about them, or not enough about them, when we could be, because you are stuck in your way of viewing or understanding things. That's his position, sort of, behind that. And he says, and there's others who have sought to re-examine their inheritance and reject what has been outgrown and restate what they think are those core or important or permanent elements, if you will. And those kind of examinations have gone on for lots. Alexander Campbell was doing that to the religious establishment, so to speak. Okay, I'm not, and so this idea of questioning, that what do you think the Protestant Reformation is? That was questioning of the way things were and were done. And so it's part of that. I'm not saying that, I'm not equating it all to the exact same thing, or the particulars, but in essence, what it is. Scott?
There's fundamental difference between what Campbell did and what this fellow was
Okay.
doing. Campbell accepted biblical revelation and
Sure.
criticized then current practices within the context of
Sure.
biblical revelation.
Sure.
This fellow denies that there is any.
Yes.
And he's attempting to construct a modern Christianity without any biblical principles.
Yes, and again,
Revealed biblical principles.
and again, where he's taking it. But I guess my point was this idea of questioning is not crazy, and it's been done. But again, where they're going with it.
Well, I would assume it's irrational.
Uh,
How
y-
does one construct a house without a foundation?
Sure. I was referring just to questioning the way things are. The way.
When you take that statement and boil it down to very basic elements, every one of us do that within our lives as we evaluate our position in this realm of Christianity. How do I see and apply
Yes.
Christianity to me?
Yes.
That's not a
Yes, and that's and that's the kind of things I'm trying to point out, that there's some foundations here that are valid, even though we may say these conclusions are where they go with them. And of course, history is full of that in all kinds of subjects, where people go much further than others would. But again, just try and understand the basic concept. This was the case when non-Jews, Gentiles, came to replace Jews in the early church. And of course, we read of that in Acts, and we read of that in Galatians, and we read of those struggles that were going on of taking the Jewish Christianity, and now you're bringing the Gentiles, the enemies, the wrong people, in those conflicts. He's kind of pointing it out, that there's conflicts that happen in these opposing ways of looking at things. When the barbarians inundated Western Europe, when economic and political changes brought about what we call the Reformation, and later when churches were founded in America, indeed, illustrations are all but innumerable of the tendency of life in changed social, economic, and intellectual conditions to bring about readjustment and even revolution in vital Christianity. And so he's looking historically, and he's saying that's what this is. Now, whether one argues it is enough or whatever, that's the position he's making. Just because the present is so abounding in change, it is to be expected that persons in sympathy with forces that are making tomorrow should follow the practice of the past and carry their new and, in their opinion, better modes of thought and living into their religion. Such persons, naturally and properly, are called modernists. So he's obviously putting a positive view. He's trying to present a positive reason to why he's a modernist. And so he says, when people see these things and they act upon these things, that's why. And as Ken pointed out, we all do that to some degree in our lives as we go about and look at things, not just as we study in our faith and things like that, but also in other things. And so that application. And so remember, if nothing else, I think we've hopefully seen this class, that what we view as, our faith and our Christianity isn't exactly what it was in the 19th century in some of their views. We don't hold to some of those understandings. I don't mean all of them, but I'm saying practices, maybe, as Scott often says, methods and practices and things. And so over and against them stand those who do not clearly see the needs of the world. So then this is him pushing back on people like Machen, who are not in sympathy with the reconstructive forces of today and have not yet used them to make religion more effective, in his view. Such persons are committed to the religious formulas and methods of the past and find in the past the authority for religiously meeting present needs. And so he's arguing and taking point with Machen as to that approach. And he says, we are in this time. We should look at things with the tools we have and how we look at things now. And so, again, we're seeing this contrast. But one fact must be recognized. The differences between these two types of Christians are not so much religious as due to different sympathies with the social and cultural forces of the day. For lack of better terms, we may distinguish them as confessional. And we say confessional was there's those defined doctrines, and you agree with them. And that's what makes you Christian and makes it right. Or dogmatic, he's continuing that with confessional. And of course, what is dogma? Dogma, which to us today is viewed in a very negative light. But what it is you're not questioning the position. Dogma is unquestioned truth, if you will. And so, in other words, we would say Jesus is the Son of God. Well, for us, that's dogma. That's unquestioned truth. Jesus rose from the dead. some would call that dogma. And so it isn't necessarily a bad term, though it's often looked at in a negative light in our times. And, of course, modernist Christians. Neither term is derogatory or precise. One group emphasizes heredity and another variation. The one grounds truth and appeal to authority, and the other to inductive methods. And so he's saying it's a different approach in his view. Both are professedly loyal to Christ. Okay, now listen to the point here. He's saying, hey, we're following Christ also, is his position. He's not claiming to be an atheist. He's not claiming to throw everything out. Like there are those that are and do and will, but he's not. Scott.
Of course, he's not claiming to be an atheist.
No.
But he's denied any basis for Christianity. So he has, in effect, become a practical atheist.
I don't disagree with you. And he's going to be one that questions the virgin birth and different things like that. But at the premise, he's trying to explain how he's come to this, whether one agrees with his conclusions or not. So each is but the dogmatist makes the Bible rather than Christ Basil. Okay, now here's a distinction he's making. He's saying we're looking to Christ, and you're getting all, in his view, kind of hung up on how they did things long ago in what is our Bible. And he's saying we're looking at Christ. How would Christ handle this? What would Jesus do? In his steps, we're going to talk about this later, was a book that was written in the late 1800s. And maybe we've heard of it, and by Charles Shelton. And it was a book that was along these lines of looking to that. What would Jesus do? And we're going to look at that with the social gospel. Each was satisfied with their respective positions, yet it is plain that the views of neither satisfy those who are in sympathy with the other social mind. It is therefore for the sake of mutual understanding and in no spirit of controversy that the dogmatic or confessional or modernist or scientific views of Christianity should be compared. Is that confusing? Yeah, it can get confusing. Probably clear in his mind, harder in ours, but nonetheless. Shaler Matthews then summarizes the issue between modernism and confessionalism is not one of mere theology. It is rather a struggle between two types of mind, two attitudes toward culture, and in consequence, two conceptions as to how Christianity can help us live. The modernist and the dogmatist are not debating on quite the same plane, or is interested in theological regularity, the other with religious development and scientific method. And so what does he mean by that? He's saying that theological regularity is, understanding, keeping things the way they are, the way they have forever, so on and so forth, and those that are seeing new insights, in his view, due to the scientific method. And so how does one live? What does this mean as to how we live? Is where he, in his mind, is coming from. Matthews, in The Faith of Modernism, goes even deeper into this analysis between the conflict. The position of the Protestants is the same as the Catholics. All over the world, they're asking their ministers and teachers to answer yes or no to questionnaires. Belief in the literal inerrancy of Scripture, the deity, the virgin birth of Jesus, the substitutionary atonement offered by Christ to God, the biblical miracles, the physical resurrection, the ascension, and the physical return of Jesus from heaven. The acceptance of all these supernatural elements they hold is essential to real Christianity. They are the fundamentals. Without religion is not Christianity. Now, we would look at that and we go, huh? Because we would say, we agree with what you're putting down here, right? As being those essential and those important things, and thus making Scott's points that he's been making about where Matthews ends up. And he's ending up and saying, eh. And of course, you know, what does it get down to? It gets down to that they're so enamored with this and our human thinking and the surety and trust in these ways of doing things that they in their mind come to it because they think truth is important, and it is, but how they think they're arriving at truth is, and they're having trust in that. And so anyhow, it's complicated, and I'm doing this for a reason, and I appreciate you bearing with me, because this is the root of what's behind all this. And so a little understanding. This opposition to the modernist interpretation of Christianity is not born of mere belligerency or unthinking reaction. In the minds of many earnest Christians, it expresses a genuine desire to maintain Orthodox Christianity as a vital religion and a fear lest modernists should be substituting sociology or scholarship or even unbelief for the gospel. Now we would say, yeah. And so he's at least giving verbal recognition to that concern. And with this fear, a modernist must confess sympathy. Huh? A religion that psychologizes God into a personification of social values that belittles the sin and their need for salvation through the working of God's Spirit that would merely substitute a liberal theology for a conservative is impotent to help a bewildered and sinful world toward the kingdom of God. And so what Matthews is saying is that, you know what, he's at least saying, I share those same concerns. Now we would say, do you really? But he would say he's claiming some sympathy with those concerns of gutting Christianity of all of its power, if you will, and the belief and so on and so forth. Modernism is concerned with the historical method of discovering the permanent values of Christianity. Now there's that phrase again. What are those timeless things, and what are just all the particulars that they did that aren't as essential? And the religious rather than the theological test of religion. It is not aiming at a system of theology, but at organizing life on a Christian basis. Keep that in mind. Organizing life. What does that mean? We'll find out. It can be understood only as one frankly admits that the modernist is deliberately undertaking to adjust Christianity to modern needs by changing the emphasis in its message and by historically evaluating and restating the permanent significance of evangelical Christianity in human life. If Christianity is essentially only what the 17th century thought it, a theological system inherited from the past, the charge that modernism is unchristian is logically sound. But it is such a concession that the modernists would die rather than make. And so he's putting the stake in the ground. And so anyhow, it's kind of deep stuff as they view at it. And so what is significant? What is most important? Now, we would say that these foundations that were listed just earlier, that's the whole basis. As we said, like Shane keeps pointing every Sunday up to the empty tomb. Without that, we have nothing. And of course, he would be one, due to his trust and stuff in the modernism scientific, would say, well, that couldn't really quite happen that way. He must have swooned, whatever that means, or maybe he really wasn't dead and he kind of came out. And many of us are familiar with those arguments because we've read those books that are tackling some of those things. But here is where this is happening 100 years ago. Matthews then goes on to challenge that he believes is lacking in confessional Christianity when he says, according to them, faith is not merely an attitude of loyalty to Christ trusting God and an application of truth to life, but the acceptance of some doctrinal formula. And so he's saying, hey, I'm trusting in Christ. I'm looking to Christ. I'm trying to think and see how Christ would react or respond to things. And you're saying, because I'm breaking away from long established understandings, that, you know, I'm all screwed up. And so that's what's going on. Now, we understand these arguments in our own way of looking at things. People all over the place. You know, in the churches of Christ, we know that we have what some have called the conservative churches. And you have those that are called the progressive churches. And in the mind of each, the others all wrong and all off and things like that. Even though all of what they hold is probably very similar, but the particulars on things, and yet that, and so I'm not equating that exactly with this, but the point is that there's always been those things. Scott.
A good many of our disputes have been irrational and perfectly detrimental to the body of Christ, but we had the disputes, which I'm not defending, don't misunderstand.
Yes.
But we held the disputes because both sides believed in biblical revelation.
Yes.
In this case, you have someone who does not believe in biblical
Sure.
revelation criticizing the practices.
Sure. Yeah, he said, yeah. But again, you have in these arguments each thinking that they're, meaning at least in our heritage particular, each is holding their positions as to why they're following Christ. They're trying to do what's right, and yet coming to very different understandings. Well, on a larger, broader, however you want to term it, scale, that's what Matthews is doing. But he's claiming, I'm still following Christ, and we would say you're gutting Christ of everything. And I'm not saying that's not a valid argument. I'm just saying that that's what's going on here. So very different perceptions. Christianity is more than dogma. It is and always has been a way of ordering life and its institutions. The insufficiency of dogmatic Christianity to express fully the religion of Jesus has always been felt, especially of late since the days of Moody. Evangelical Christianity has been developing a layman's theology which has placed increased emphasis on practical religion, the love of God, and his readiness to receive those who seek him. So he's pointing out what's going on. Remember, Moody was a revivalist. Okay, these guys up in Princeton and these other places coming from a little different point of view. And so they're very intellectual. And whereas Moody and what they're doing is that's Christianity on what would be called a more emotional level. It's not as academic in that understanding. And so he's kind of contrasting that. Thus, many doctrines once judged invaluable for Christian living have been tactically outgrown, and it would, for instance, perplex the majority of Presbyterians to give the 5 points of Calvinism. Yet, 300 years ago, these were vehemently asserted and enforced by the Reformed churches. He's saying the Presbyterians aren't enforcing that. And at one time, people were being burned at the stake and losing their head and so on and so forth. Because they weren't publicly holding on to those. And so these were disagreements. One might go on indefinitely showing how doctrines are not reputed but cease function in life of earnest Christians whose attention is shifted from technical theology to practical religious interests. The simple fact is that the center of interest in religion is passing from theology to life. The tendency is bound to demand intellectual justification other than inherited authority can give. Men seek to answer questions of practical living suggested to the religious faith by methods successful to other fields of inquiry. Okay, that gets a little little interesting. Let me move on. It is with this understanding the foundation of what has been called the social gospel is built. If Christians can take the principles of Christianity and apply them to society, and if those powers of society can be Christianized, then we will be doing what Christ wants, and that is to love and to care for one another. The involvement in social issues is the application of the teachings of Jesus. And this picture is a lithograph, and it's Jesus there in the middle, showing them among the poor, is what he's saying, is what this is illustrating. And so this is the foundation of what he means by practical Christianity, of applying it. This is where they're coming from. That was the basis of social gospel. In other words, you know what? We got this government up here that's real powerful. And so if we can get the right people in there to think right and to care about these things, we can get these programs and so on that care about people. And thus, behind that is what we had with what was all the progressivism that came about in the early 1900s, early in the 1900s, and clearly manifested itself strongly in FDR's New Deal. This was a lot of the foundation. These are those claiming Christianity, and that is why they were doing this. And so the idea of where the government became the welfare state had its roots from this. Okay? And so just trying to get that understanding, Christians looking at and applying, and a Christian is more than just exactly the doctrinal things you believe, and is saying, how can we do that good? And so it was viewed that being involved in these things, in the union movements and so on, to make people's lives better, that were working in those conditions, and all these things, that was doing the work of Christ. That was doing what we should be doing as Christians. Now, of course, one of the problems or arguments against that was, what about the rest of it? And so, in true fashion, what do? If this part of it's not right, we got to get as far away from it as we can. We got to go to the other side, because if that's wrong, it must all be wrong. And I think if we look and study, and I don't mean just on this topic, that rarely is that wholly true. That it's all wrong and everything about it, nothing good. Can anything good come out of Nazareth, right? And so I wanted us to try to understand this, and it actually goes on further, and I won't bore you with it because we'll get into our history next week. But there's also something called the intellectual gospel that kind of built off this, and those people weren't trying to make Christ, in their view, the center of it, and they put their trust in the science and all these kind of things. And so for them, they substituted, I am doing right because I'm trying to find out truth and do these things, and they didn't even try to keep Christ in it. And so some have called that the scientific gospel. And I won't bore you with it. And so, just real quickly, what happened in the 50s and 60s to where we, the conservative wing of things, what was happening to the mainline denominations in the 50s and 60s and 70s? People were leaving. And we looked at that and said, what? They're leaving because there's no gospel there. And I'm not saying that there isn't truth in that, but there was no gospel there. That's why they're losing. That's why all those people are leaving, because they're not holding to it. And that there was truth in that for sure. What do we do now where the same things happen to those of us that are saying we're believing? We're not, and again, I'm not equating the same reasons or anything like that, but I'm saying, whoa, you know, we got to be careful when things aren't good about doing that and saying that's why, because that may be, and it may be other things too. It's always hard to tell, but nonetheless. So hopefully this understanding, this is going to make sense, because we're going to be referring back to these things as we look at our particulars and our history of what's going on. Does this make a little more sense than it did last week? It will be more understandable as we get into the narrative. Okay, so thank you. We're done. Ken says about time.